met McCoy. She's an artist from New York, and she is a Jain as well. So we can follow a Jain artist from New York.
Yes, absolutely. I'm the only non-Indian, non-Gujarati speaking member of the Queen's Jain Temple.
The Queen's Jain? I see.
The Jain Temple of Queens. So in partition, like I'll be the only non-Indian in a group of 1,000 people.
Yes, I can feel good here because I have been 2 times Parisian at London in the Jain community. And me also, I was the only one not speaking Gujarati or any other language. But they have turned to English now there. And for us it is a great, great pleasure that you are exposing your paintings in our hometown Berlin and that you have a connection to Berlin as well.
I love Berlin. I was here in 1977 when the wall was up. And I was a guest of the God, the Deutsche Akademische Auslandsdienst. And so I went to the Fraueninsel and I found it to be this really magical place. And I never forgot it. And right now I'm so disturbed with what's happening in America. I'm so disturbed with what's happening in the world. It's becoming, so much of the resources of the world, especially in America, we've become the crops of the world. We've become the merchants of death. All of our resources now go into making armaments, things to kill people. And this is very disturbing for me. Because right now I think we need a whole new vision for the world. A vision that doesn't include making things to kill people, instead of making things to feed people or to help people. But I feel that the world right now needs a whole sort of change of dynamic. And that's why Jainism, I think, is so important, is because of the practice of ahimsa. And my fairy tale is really about ahimsa. It's about taking, the king always represents the old ruling consciousness of the land. And this is about taking an old type of consciousness, transforming it, bringing the dark and the light, the 2 halves together, examining it, and saying it's time for a new perspective. And the son represents, the king's son, the prince, represents a new perspective.
Yeah.
And this perspective has to do with love and nonviolence and a new world. And so this fairy tale on the Fraueninsel is not meant to be just sort of a utopian thing. It's meant to be about how to change a kind of world consciousness. Because if we don't do this, we're in very big trouble.
Yeah.
And no one seems to think of this. I mean, I really wonder if a Mahatma Gandhi, could exist today. I mean, here you have India and Pakistan building bigger and bigger nukes. You have the United States and the Israelis and everyone building more and more weapons. And I feel that we need a kind of, the way Gandhi was a break from the past, I feel we need this kind of consciousness right now.
And to think that Jainism is going to give us Westerners and Indians and Easterners a new perspective in the right direction?
I think that the Jainism has 2 really big ideas. One is ahimsa, the doctrine of nonviolence. Mahatma Gandhi had a lot of friends who were Gujarati. He was Gujarati, and he was very influenced by the doctrine of ahimsa, of nonviolence. The other big theory of Jainism that I think we need in the world is the theory of anekantavada. Because the problem is if you say to somebody, I have the truth, and I'm a Christian, and I have the only way to be, or I'm a Muslim, and I have the only way to be, and everybody else is the devil, and only I am right, then you immediately cut off the dialogue. And when you have this kind of rigidity, then the dialogue stops. The wonderful thing about Jainism and anekantavada is you can say, this is my perspective, this is your perspective, and you're not saying I'm right and you're wrong. You're saying we have different perspectives. But these perspectives form points, like on a giant globe. They're just different. But I can also see your perspective. And the moment you're able to see that, you really break the opposites. this marriage of the king and the sultan is about bringing these opposites together. And that's what Anakantabad does. It brings these opposites together. You have a meeting point where you can see another person's perspective. The problem in America right now is we have no shadow reflection, and we have no way of having a meeting point. Because, you have George Bush saying, only I am right, only Christians are right, everybody else in the world is wrong. And that's a terrible way to be. And the Taliban is the same. Right now in the world we have everybody in these rigid, fixed, very defended positions, where they not only say, I'm right, but they build a tower to say I'm right, and then they put guns on the tower, and they defend it, and everybody is rigidly defended and armed to the teeth. And this is no way to have a world dialogue.
Yeah, and that's what we need, the dialogue, not only between cultures, but between nations, and we have to realize that it is one earth where all of us are living.
I keep thinking that, like, after 9/11, if say you had sort of like a Jane president, after 9/11, he would have said, this is terrible, what happened is terrible, but we have to look at the perspective. We have to look at the perspective, and he would have called in religious leaders from around the world, political leaders from around the world, and he would have said, we can't go forward like this anymore. We have to stop. And he would have had some huge conference that maybe lasted a month of world religious leaders all talking to each other, all trying to have a dialogue. And that would, and saying, what have we done to bring this on? What have we done to magnetize this? Because, violence is like a boomerang in Australia. If you put violence out, the violence eventually comes back to your doorstep.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think that's why we need another perspective, and one that involves, the other thing about Jainism that's really good is it involves almost like a confessional, like the Catholics have, where you're looking at your darkness, and you're saying, okay, I've been greedy. I mean, Jains have huge shadows too, trust me, especially with money. They're killers, but I'm not saying Jainism doesn't have a shadow too in a lot of its members. I mean, it has a terrible shadow of money. But I think it does have this idea of a kind of confessional, or paryusha, where you're looking at your greed, you're looking at your false things, and this is what the world needs. It needs to look at all of these aspects. Because it's not happening.
Yeah.
So it certainly is not happening. I mean, I think there are a few people who are starting to do this, but we need someone who can bring these hands together.
Yeah. And what do you think, what kinds of person this should be? Or could it even be a person? Could it not only be a group or a dialogue in a group that people meet, that they exchange, that they start to communicate?
I don't know. I mean, in America, I'm pretty depressed about it. I think you have people like Kuchinik, you have people who want to have a dialogue, but you also have people who are terrified of the dialogue. It's becoming very isolationist. I don't know I pray that it's possible, because I think that America's going into a catastrophic mess at the moment, and I think that it's going to take a real visionary to pull it out. I mean, I'm not so optimistic. I think that, Goethe said sometimes things have to come to a really bad point, and then the light can come forward.
Yes.
I think we're going to have to see that. But I became a Jain because of the notion of ahimsa.
Yeah. So I understand why Atusha, our friend from London, said that we are kindred souls, because that's why I became a Jain as well. It was because of ahimsa and Anakantabad. Yes. And this, what you said, Anakantabad, that I can see the world in another view when I understand what you are telling me, and I can take your viewpoint as well. I cannot say this is wrong, I'm on the right.
When I understood the concept of in Indian philosophy of Anakanta or Anakantabad, it was as though a kind of my brain suddenly just opened up, and I was able to finally have tolerance, even for some of the people in my university class, that I couldn't stand. I was in a university with some very rigid, fascist sort of Marxist feel, people who couldn't stand spirituality, and really hated everything I stood for, and it was so difficult to teach with those people. Yeah, sometimes I wanted to shoot somebody. It's funny, I'm Irish.
Yeah, sure.
But
you are Irish?
Yeah, Irish American.
I see.
So my humor's a bit off. But anyway, but even when I learned on the content, I could understand that there were good points to the Marxist perspective, or I could see the ways in which it was good, the ways in which, and I was able to somehow say, well, I agree with you in these ways and maybe not in these ways.
Oh, you started to
communicate. I started to communicate, which is something I hadn't done before. I mean, it made me realize that I think that so many people are so fearful. They get a position, they get a philosophical position, they get an intellectual position, and then they become fixed. And for reasons that are kind of economic imperative, for reasons that are kind of whatever, they become fixed. And they say, okay, this is my position, my tenure depends upon it, my position in whatever temple depends upon it, or in government depends upon it, and I'm going to defend this.
Yeah.
And then I will only have people who think like me involved with me. I will not let any new anything in, and I will defend it, and it will become more and more rigid. And that's what we're seeing now. Carl Jung said that at the end of this millennium, we would see people who were afraid, really, of this notion of anaconda, afraid of kind of bringing the opposites together, afraid of finding their own center within this multiple viewpoints. Yeah. That people who are unable to find the self-structure, the Atman, would then become more and more dependent on Tanas of life and spiritual colors of life. And it has to do with warmth, with love, eros. Yeah. It has to do with, because that's something there's not a lot of right now. We don't hear people talking about love or positive human relationships or eros, And by eros, I don't mean just eroticism, although that's a product of it, but I mean positive human relationships that involve love and compassion and caring between people. Yeah. That's the opposite of what we're seeing right now. We're not seeing a lot of this in the world today. That's why I wanted people to see, like, this is a Western king, and this is an Eastern king. Yeah. They're both very rigid guys. And in my fairy tale, they die, and they go through several processes, and they end up and they realize they're the same person, that their rigid point of view is the same. And only when they see that are they able to transform into something else.
And the transformation, and this is
the female principle, and I think that one of the problems with so much is that we have forgotten the idea that spirituality involves both masculine and feminine. Spirituality transcends gender in a strange way. And there has to be a kind of new birth. And in a funny way, I mean, this is a birth image right here. It's kind of almost like the birth of Mahavir. You see, in the writings of Mahavir, there's a wonderful, wonderful part in the writings of Mahavir where Mahavir is talking about the drop of dew on a flower. And it's an incredibly beautiful quote in Sanskrit about someone. And I actually thought of that when I was making this birth image out of a flower.
Yeah. And I have seen the motive of the bird in several.
The bird is the same thing in almost every religion. The bird is the animal who can fly up to communicate with the divine. You get a Holy Ghost. Yeah. You get the bird is the animal that is able to go back and forth between the heavens and the earth.
Yeah. And it is the red bird.
Which has to do with, I didn't want to have it like the Holy Ghost. This isn't Redbird. This has to do with, again, this kind of eros. And by eros, I mean the kind of eros, that which was truly meant by Aphrodite. Aphrodite wasn't just, there she is. Aphrodite wasn't just a love goddess concerning, people think of Aphrodite as a love goddess between men and women, but Aphrodite represented positive human relationships of all kinds, and a kind of compassion and eros and love between all people. It wasn't just sexual love, it was eros with a capital E really represents the eros principle, which is something much greater.
Yeah.
It's something that has to do with positive human relationships on a very grand scale.
Yeah.
And we don't have this. It's hard to imagine someone like Bush or Cheney involved in positive human relations. It would be incredible if we had world leaders having conferences on things like this, on how to have kind of non-violent, positive, loving human relations. And maybe how to find this within every world religion, within every structure.
Yeah.
The only thing we have now are governments deciding how best to defend themselves with the biggest guns. And I think that, Europeans are a bit better at this, I think, because Europe went through, two horrible world wars. The Germans, the French, everybody behaved very badly. The Russians killed millions of people, the Germans killed millions of people. Everybody in Europe suffered through two horrible world wars, behaving very badly.
Yeah.
And so after this happened, I think Europeans are now living in what I call a post-war mentality.
Yeah.
Where they said, okay, we've done this. We've been there, we've done this, it didn't work, we destroyed our whole continent, we killed millions of people. We need to think of a new way to live. I think the Russians are still caught up in it a bit, and the Americans are still in a pre-war mentality. They're still thinking that the way to solve all problems is to just go out and kill everybody and have bigger guns, bigger bombs. I think that the Germans learned their lesson. I think the French learned their lesson. The Italians with their fascism learned their lesson. All of these people have said, we behaved terribly. This is no longer the way to be in the world. We need to find a new way to be. And so in a strange way, I find Europe very, very progressive compared to America. America is frightening at the moment. America is moving backwards. It's a frightening phenomenon. I think that America produces more guns than the entire world combined at the moment. That's a frightening thing. And I think that, if anything, I think that the Europeans are ahead now. It took horrible lessons for people to learn.
And it costed so many people their lives.
So many people. I think they say now that the Stalin killed 20 million people, the Germans at least 10 million people, 6 million Jews. The French colonies in Africa, the British colonies, it's a horrible history in all of these places. It's a really, really horrible history.
And I think you are right. The Europeans feel out of first it was a stage of shame in Germany, for example. This I can tell. In Germany it was the situation, people were so much ashamed and felt so much guilty about what happened. And then they said, we have to think, we have to put our reason into action.
Absolutely, and I think the second generation, I did that big piece at Medina, and there were a lot of young Germans there, and I think that the next generation of Germans absolutely said, this is so horrible that we have to think in a different way. And I think that it transformed the next generation of Germans. And I think that with Italy too, I think Italy moved very far to the left. I think Italy also said, and Spain. It's interesting. Spain after Franco, terrible fascist, militaristic regime. It was interesting when those bombs occurred in Spain on the train. Instead of having a 911 thing where they said, okay, we're going to have more guns and more police and more this and more that, they immediately, within 2 days of the 3 days, voted out a prime minister who wanted to be a warmonger and said, no, we're going in a different direction now. I mean, if only we had that kind of sanity in America. I think that it's sad because I think the problem America has is that America cannot look at any of the consequences of its actions. I mean, it's so funny. I mean, I have Irish parents, and I was in India last year doing a big project on kind of the death and transformation of the monkey king, where he goes through all these processes and is reborn in the hall of the Jinas as Kunimon, the monkey king, in a golden egg. And of course, the Indians loved it, but you know, for the first time in my life, I felt so ashamed. I felt so ashamed because I just felt that this kind of, I think Americans are in a terrible state right now. I mean, we feel ashamed. We belong to a nation of war criminals. I mean, when I see pictures of these little babies that are born because of the uranium in these bombs in Iraq, I mean, I'm horrified when I think of the thousands of little women and children who are now going into the morgues, just being stacked up like wood in these morgues because of this. It's terrible. It's really terrible.
And what do you feel as a Jane when you hear this? This is concerning you, as you are a human being living on this planet. On the other hand, nobody asked you to participate in this, and it was not your decision to do this. How can you live seeing these depressing...
It is hard. I think that we always have to say no. I think we can never be totally pacifists. I think we always have to stand up and be counted. I mean, as an artist, I have tried to, like with my piece at Medina, with my piece at Code in India, with my work here, I always try to say, wait, we have to have a new viewpoint. I feel that the artist has to be a light bringer. There's a wonderful thing in Jainism where you do the puja with the lamp. And when you are holding up the lamp in the puja, it is lighting, you're finding a kind of light within you, you're finding a kind of light within Regina. This is about bringing light. And I feel that the lamp puja is probably one of the most important things in Jainism, because I personally feel that artists need to be light bringers. If you can't bring light into the world as an artist, you're in big trouble. The problem with so much art is now that it represents the problem. It represents the problem of violence and materialism, but it never represents the solution. Carl Jung said that a dream can show you the problem, but the dream always contains the seed of the solution to the problem. And I feel that artists can certainly talk about the problem. I'm talking about the problem here. But I feel that as an artist, you also need to represent the solution. Because the moment artists stop being light bringers, then we all need to be light bringers in every field. I mean, my brother's a wild animal veterinarian. He founded the biggest wetlands on the Mexican border. He raised $50 million to do this in government grants. And the Bush government just put a border fence through the middle of it and took the tops off 2 mountains, which are destroying a national park that's now worth $100 million, that provides habitat for birds and cleans up all the raw sewage in the world. In that area. And my brother did this volunteer, didn't take any money. He's a poor veterinarian at the zoo. And now his entire life's work is destroyed. And I mean, thank God my brother meditates. He's an amazing human being. He's been a disciple of the Maharishi with transcendental meditation for like 30 years. And he's a vegetarian. So my brother's a really good guy. But I think that, it's discouraging. But I think that we all have to try to be positive. Sometimes it fails. But I think that we have to keep trying. Because I think it's better to try and die. And I mean, when your life is over, I think you want to say, at least I tried.
Yeah.
If you don't try, you might as well just, go to the football matches and watch television or eat and drink yourself to death or whatever the deal is. I mean, it's not the right way to go.
You also are a vegetarian?
Of course, and I don't drink, I don't smoke anymore, so I think that's important. I try not to judge it, though. I mean, Hitler was vegan, so we can't say that that's going to save you. I was telling my Jane friends, remember Hitler was a vegan. Yeah. So I mean, that's not going to completely save you, but I think that the idea of the reverence for all life is a very important idea. Because I think if you can kill a chicken, or if you can kill a cow, you can kill a person. I mean, I grew up my life on a cattle ranch.
I see.
So, I didn't see the cows being killed because my brother did. And my brother actually is a veterinarian, and as part of his training, he had to work in the slaughterhouse to inspect the meat. And the next week in medical school, he said, never again. And he's been a vegetarian for the rest of his life, and he's 55.
Understandable.
In New York, in fact, I live next to the live poultry market. So, oh my God, so every day in New York, I walk by and I see these poor chickens screaming as they're going to their death, or these rabbits, it's so sad. So I think reverence for life is important, and reverence for all life, and that's something that we don't have. And I also think another important part of James is the idea of a kind of reverence for nature, reverence for life. Because if you aren't consuming cows, cows take a lot of grassland. Cows take huge amounts of resources. It takes thousands and thousands of hectares to make enough grass to feed the cow. Mm-hmm. Those thousands of hectares could be used to make grains or fruit or whatever to feed people. It's a much more economical system.
Yeah.
Produces much less carbon dioxide.
We have published on our website the economies of Roma.
It's so hard. I know the biggest problem I had becoming a Jain was I couldn't find anything in translation. It's so hard. I mean, you can't find a good English translation that's not for puja. You can find a few translations of things like the Bhagavad Sutra and some of the main sutras, but there are lots of things in Jainism where there's still no there's no good English translation of Chittaganga, which is part of the puja. There is no good translation of it, just a few bits here and there. So for an English-speaking Jain, it's still very difficult in terms of translation. And I think that this is going to get better because a lot of Jain children can't Dhamma, Sanskrit, Pratik, they're going to have to translate more.
About 100,000 Jains are living non-resident Indians. They are living in the UK and in the USA. I think 50,000 in the United Kingdom and 50,000 in the United States. And they try more and more, for example, the Jaina Education Committee, they try to put it into very good English to give it to their people, to their children.
You do. You have the Jain Study Group in New York. I think people are trying really, really hard. But I can tell you, it still is hard to find. If you're actually doing the practice, I'm a Sambar.
Yeah.
And I'm a Sambar Jain, and I'm not a Digambar. I'm a Sambar pretty much. But I'm actually, to be honest with you, I'm somewhere halfway between a Sambar and a Sanac Qazi, probably. I'm somewhere in the middle, I think. The beautiful thing about the New York Jain community is that we have everything under one roof, so that there's much more communication between all the different Jains.
So there is a Jain community in New York, including Western people as well? As you are?
I'm the only one who belongs to the actual temple, but Gurudev Chitravanu founded a huge Jain movement in New York, and also Shishil Muni in New Jersey in the early days.
Yeah.
But the American Jains don't go to the temple. I'm the only one, actually. I go occasionally for a lecture or something, but they don't actually do it. I actually like the puja part because I came from a Catholic background. I love all
Oh,
the
yeah.
ritual.
Yeah.
And I actually feel better when I do it.
Yeah. I think it is a way to approach the divine as well. I think it is some go other ways, but it is a very practical way. For me also, I have done it sometimes when I was in London to Pratishtha Mahatsav of London Jain Temple. I also go to Jain Temple like in India, and there I have discovered how beautiful it can be.
I think so too, and also I think just for me, I mean, New York is a really tough city because it's all about money, it's all about Wall Street. When I lived in California, it was easy. I used to go to the Vedanta temple or to the trust, oh God, there was a big ashram up on the hill in New York. I can't remember what it's called. But when I lived in New York, I used to go to these things. I mean, in California, and in New York, it's much harder because it's all about Wall Street.
Yeah.
It's all about money. New York, I think, is probably the most heavily materialistic consciousness ever. And it's become worse. Now all the artists are fleeing to Berlin, and they're coming here, and all that is left in New York are people who are only interested in money and Wall Street.
I see. How did you come to Judaism?
This is a very weird story. I was with a man named, I was very depressed one winter. It was in the year 2000. I was very depressed, and I was tired of the art world because I feel like the art world has lost its connection to spirit. It's become so kind of Marxist and materialistic, and it's really lost its soul on a lot of levels. And I was very depressed about the art world, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And a friend of mine said, why don't you go, and I said, and my dog died. My first Muffs died, and I was so depressed about my dog dying. And a friend of mine was talking about India, and said he knew Walter Spink, Professor Spink is the biggest, has spent 50 years as the biggest scholar of Ajanta and Ellora. So I said, okay, I emailed Walter Spink, and he said, come on over, and because we're photographing caves for a big book. And he said, I'm here with a huge team of photographers. He said, come now, because he said, it's one of the only times you'll be able to see the caves with a lot of light, because we're photographing murals. And they will have scaffolding set up. You'll be able to see parts of the caves that no one ever sees. Because it was in India? Yeah, in Ajanta and Ellora. The caves of Ajanta. And because usually you have to see them with a torch. And so I said, sure, I'll come. So first, I was in India. First, Walter Spink said, while you're in Mumbai, be sure to go to Elephanta, because the caves of Elephanta are phase 1, the earliest form of the cave.
Yeah.
So I went to Elephanta, and when I was at Elephanta, I got caught. It was the end of the monsoon, and I got caught in a freezing rainstorm. And I was soaked. And so I came off the island, and there was this really cab driver that was, I thought, out for bakshish. And I was so cold, and I was staying way at the Thames corner. And he finally said, let me just take you someplace dry. And I felt like saying no. And then I finally said, okay, just take me someplace dry. And first he took me to Gandhi's house, and I saw the murals about Ahimsa and nonviolent protest. And then he took me to the big Jain temple in Mumbai. I had never heard of Jainism. I didn't know what Jains were. I had no idea about Jainism. And I went to the temple, and I spent the entire day there. I felt like I had been there my entire life. But I didn't think about it. I just liked it. And then after that, I went to Ajanta and Ellora, and I spent a lot of time in the Jain caves. And there was a tiny shrine at Ellora outside of the perimeters where they have a tiny temple, probably to one of the sects of the Dada Guru sects. Because I remember there was a figure, so it was probably one of the Dada Guru sects of Jainism. And I went to that little Jain shrine. And then, after I went to that Jain shrine, I still didn't think And I decided to do the Rajasthan loop. And my driver said, I want to take you someplace. And I said, okay. And he took me to Ranipur. And I was at Ranipur, and I was in the temple, and I had this amazing experience at the temple in Ranipur. And I decided, when I was at Ranipur, I decided, something happened at Ranipur, and I'm not sure what it was. And at Ranipur, I decided that I really had to, something happened, and I couldn't describe it, but I felt that the temple at Ranipur was not only on the outside, but the temple at Ranipur existed as an imaginal place in my imagination. This concept has been dead in the West for years, but it's like St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, had these spiritual exercises where in your imagination you would go into a spiritual place that would then become a kind of architectural place within yourself. And that's what, and it was like, at Ranipur, it was like the outer and the inner merged in a way. I have a big painting, a drawing called Sanctuary on my website that's that dream of Ranipur. And so after Ranipur, I was there, and the Pujari of Ranipur walked up to me. And he suddenly said to me in English, he said, you're not like all these other people here. He said, something else has happened here, come meditate with me. So I went and I meditated with the Pujari of Ranipur for a while. And then he said, there is a Jain guru in New York City named Gurudev Chitravanu, and there's a Jain meditation center on 86th Street. And I wrote it down and I forgot about it. And I got back to New York, and I finally contacted Gurudev, and I went to a couple of lectures. And it was great, and I loved the lectures, but I also wanted to actually become a Jain. So I looked at Jainism in the phone book. And at that time, our temple was a little teeny garage. It wasn't when we built the $17 million temple. It was a little garage.